Hello and welcome to the next episode of Mayor Brown's video series at the Crossroads, CFTC and DOJ Enforcement. I'm Matt Kluchenek, a partner at Mayor Brown, a member of Mayor Brown's Litigation and Dispute Resolution Group, whose practice focuses on derivatives, securities, cryptocurrencies. I'm joined once again today by my partner, Glen Kopp, also a partner at Mayor Brown, member of Mayor Brown's White Collar Defense Group, and a former federal prosecutor from the Southern District of New York. As you know, possibly know, each week our goal is to bring to you an interesting topic that overlaps each of the CFTC and the DOJ enforcement worlds. Glenn?
Thanks, Matt. So what we're going to do is over the next couple of sessions, we're going to talk about cooperation. We're going to talk about in the context of cooperation with the CFTC. We're going to talk about it in the context of cooperation with the DOJ in terms of DOJ investigations. And we're also going to talk about it in another session, sort of the overlap of the DOJ and the CFTC investigation, sort of how to manage cooperation with both entities consistent with the sort of crossroads theory here. And so today, we really want to focus on cooperation with the CFTC. And so Matt, my first question to you is, generally speaking, what's the mindset of clients when cooperation comes up in the context of a potential violation on the CFTC side of the house?
Thanks, Glenn. So I would say, generally speaking, the mindset is one of reluctance, but that's changing. And I think credit goes to the CFTC in terms of making or helping companies and individuals think about more seriously whether or not cooperation is in order. Cooperation means a number of different things. We'll get into that a little bit, but I would say the baseline is reluctance. But again, that has been changing over the last few years.
And Matt, is the shift something that you see because of the shift in the CFTC sort of entrance into the world of cooperation, which is sort of, for the CFTC at least, is relatively new? Is that right?
That's right. I mean, the notion of cooperation has been there for many, many, many years in terms of dealing with enforcement, but it really became much more concrete, if you will, when the CFTC issued a couple of advisories in 2017. Two very similar advisories, one focused on individuals, the other focused on companies. And those advisories, big impact, big signal to the market participant community that from the CFTC's Division of Enforcement perspective, cooperation can matter, can make a difference. So you had the two advisories in 2017. That was followed up in 2019 with another cooperation advisory that focused on the FCPA and foreign corruption violations under the Commodity Exchange Act. That was a standalone advisory. And then even more recently in 2020, you had another, an update cooperation advisory where the CFTC really sought to convey greater transparency in terms of its expectations and its requirements in an effort to let the marketplace know that if you're going to make cooperative efforts and then ultimately ask for meaningful relief or a declination, these are the specific things that we want to see. And so as we sit here now, we have 4 cooperation advisories out there. They're all pretty well synchronized. I mean, there's some differences. For example, in the FCPA advisory, Division of Enforcement says that it will apply a presumption of no civil monetary penalty if there is full cooperation, voluntary disclosures, reporting, so on and so forth. You don't see that in the other advisory. One other thing to note as well, in the advisories, the focus ultimately is the idea of the credit is in the form of a reduced civil monetary penalty, does not impact, and none of the advisories talk about any reduction with respect to disgorgement or restitution. So solely focused on CMPs.
And Matt, so you've I think hinted a little bit about what cooperation means based on the advisories, but could you break down the elements that the CFTC requires for full cooperation?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Really important to unpack this because each element sort of holds its own weight and really important in terms of what you do and when you do it. If you're interested in, or if a market participant is interested in getting some sort of potential cooperation credit. So the first one would be that of self-reporting. And so if an entity or an individual becomes aware of a potential violation, I'd say, and I would argue that the most important element of cooperation would be a voluntary self-report disclosure to the relevant regulator. I think that's more critical than anything else, if a client's going to go down that path. And self-disclosure, can take a number of different forms. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that there's necessarily a violation. It could be couched in the sense that we believe a violation may have occurred, or we believe that there's suspect conduct. And so we're proactively picking up the phone, reaching out to you, probably doing a presentation to relevant staff, so on and so forth. Timing is really important though, because there have been a number of instances where clients have sought to make a self-report, but the regulator was already aware of the conduct. So if that's the situation, self-report is not going to be very helpful. So it becomes a really, really important timing consideration. If there's potential wrongdoing, making a decision relatively quickly, if there's going to be a self-report, and then promptly doing so. And again, the goal here is to make that self-report before the regulator is aware of it. Another second key element would be that of full cooperation. The notion that there's going to be requests for documents, there's going to be requests for testimony, and the expectation of enforcement will be that that will be voluntarily provided. There won't have to be subpoenas. There'll be some back and forth in terms of negotiation of scope, but the idea is that that information, testimony, will be voluntarily provided. And then the third element here, increasingly important, would be that of remediation. Enforcement, I think, is critically, focused on, okay, something happens, you've self-reported it, you're being a good citizen in terms of cooperation, and now we want to see what you've done to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And so, if, for example, hypothetically, we're talking about spoofing conduct, is there surveillance in place? Are there third-party systems? Are there third-party systems, surveillance systems that the Division of Enforcement is aware of and is comfortable with? Policies, procedures, training, ever important. It's a whole battery of things that make up corrective actions, and all these things come to bear as part of the calculus for cooperation.
Matt, just on that point, what level of proof does the CFTC demand when it comes to remediation? What are they really looking for?
Yeah, it's a good question, Glenn. I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as a proof standard. I think, and it's really, really focused on the facts and circumstances. So that the nature of the particular conduct, the size, sophistication of the organization. But I think it kind of comes down to, does the division believe that the entity is putting forth, quite frankly, its best efforts to ensure that the conduct is not repeated? That can take, again, a lot of different forms. In discussions with enforcement staff, it's robust. There's companies thinking about doing this. The company has done this. You're constantly getting feedback. You're trying to find that happy balance. You're trying to maintain reasonableness, because corrective actions can be extremely expensive. And sometimes only do incrementally better for the cost. So there's that cost benefit analysis. But again, it really is a back and forth, give and take, if you will, with enforcement staff.
Got it. And so if you have all that, Matt, you've got the voluntary self-report, cooperation, remediation. Will the CFTC disclose that or publicly acknowledge it at the resolution of the case?
That has, the answer is yes, and certainly was the trend for quite some time. And so if you look at consent orders, you'll note typically whether or not an entity has cooperated, the commission will come out and say, we acknowledge or we appreciate the cooperation of the entity, so on and so forth. Different language that's becoming a little bit more formalized now in terms of the nature of the language. Sometimes it will reference that there has been a reduction in the CMP. Sometimes it will say a substantial reduction. Certain adjectives that can be used to help telegraph to the marketplace that this was a certain level of cooperation that enforcement staff appreciated, which resulted in a meaningful reduction in the CMP.
Got it. Thanks, Matt. So Matt, if you don't mind, can you just give our viewers some takeaways in terms of cooperation with the CFTC in connection with their investigation?
Sure. So a few takeaways. I think one key takeaway would be that cooperation in the sense of, do we self-disclose? Do we respond to voluntary requests? Do we take corrective actions? Should at least be part of the calculus consideration if there's a discovery of potential wrongdoing. A lot of circumstances, self-reporting, for example, it might not be appropriate. In some circumstances, it may be appropriate, but the key thing is here, now it's part, I think, of the calculus. And again, I think some credit goes to the CFTC in terms of recognizing meaningful cooperation in the context of reduced CMPs. It's clearly one takeaway. Another takeaway is when thinking about self-reporting, for example, there is no guarantee. There's no formula that says if you do X, Y, and Z, it will necessarily result in a certain penalty or a certain sanction. Really important to keep in mind as well. The other thing is, if you're gonna go down the route of self-reporting cooperation and you expect to receive either a declination from enforcement or a really substantially reduced CMP, got to make sure all your ducks are in a row. So you've got to do some planning in advance, thinking about, again, timing of the self-report. What are you prepared to do, not do in terms of cooperating throughout the process? Making sure that you're prepared to, meaningfully develop and implement corrective actions. If you're prepared to do, two of those things, for example, but on corrective actions, you think everything looks pretty good and you don't need to do much else, that's not going to be viewed so positively, and the client may not get the result it wants. So really just kind of understanding each of those three elements or buckets, being prepared with respect to each of the three in advance of going forward to the CFTC, I think is a really important takeaway.
Thank you, Matt.
Great. Glenn, great questions as always. So this concludes this session of At the Crossroads, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks.